Well, welcome everybody. This is Subscription Insiders webinar, Transform Subscriber Retention. And we're going to do this by focusing today on payment experiences. And what our goal today is we want you to learn how to address payment experience related issues to transform your customer relationships, to reduce churn, lower costs, and increase lifetime value. I have Steve Arentzoff today. He is the Senior Vice President of Marketing over at FlexPay. They work with many brands across the subscription economy on this very subject, and we're going to really tap into his expertise. I'm going to let Steve talk to you in person about his background and why he's somebody you want to be listening to. But I'm going to just mention one more thing before I get out of our slides, which is our upcoming subscription show. For all of those who know Subscription Insider, we provide news and information to help you run and operate your business more profitably. And our subscription show coming up in New York, October 24th and 25th, will be a great opportunity for you to hear from leaders and experts and your colleagues across the industry on everything from payment success to scaling growth opportunities in high volume businesses. You're going to hear case studies from leading streaming services, leading media businesses, leading software businesses. So we've really got an exciting program planned for you. And I hope to be able to see all of you in New York, October 24th and 25th. And you can see the URL right there. So with that, I'm going to get back to us talking about payment experiences. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat window. And this is going to be a discussion with myself and with Steve. And this is your time. So please do not be shy. I want everybody to ask your questions as we get going. And there's some really important concepts that we want to make sure you do understand to help you in your business. So with that, Steve, can you introduce yourself and give people in the audience today a sense of your background and why it's really relevant to payment experiences?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. First of all, I want to say it's a pleasure to join you today. The Subscription Insight organization is a really important resource for our industry to get access to insights and information to help them be more successful. So I'm really thrilled to be here today talking about this important topic. Um, as you mentioned, I am Senior Vice President of Marketing at FlexPay. We are in the failed payments recovery solution business. Before FlexPay, I was a marketing vice president at Medallia, which is one of the leading customer experience management platforms. So customer experience, customer satisfaction, retention are areas I'm particularly passionate about. So the intersection between the payments experience and what it means for SAT and retention for subscribers is incredibly important. So it's gonna be a fun topic we can dig into today.
Thank you, Steve. So I want to get started with talking about experience. I think most of us in today, we're familiar with the concept of the product experience, of designing products that are going to be a great experience, those features and functions that people need. I think people are familiar with the concept of the customer experience, the UI, optimizing that. And between the product and the CX, they overlap a little bit, but there might be a third, and that's what we're going to be talking about that overlaps a little bit, called the payment experience. And can you define what you
Yeah.
consider the payment experience? Because I think some of us might think of it as part of the UI, part of the product, but it's really something unique. So can you explain that for us?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to step back and look at what are the experiences that subscribers have with the brands they've chosen to do business with, right?
Mhm.
Um, so when they enter in a subscription, there's going to be interactions with the product or service. And so there's the product experience itself, which is incredibly important. Of course, subscription companies invest enormous resources in optimizing that and getting feedback from their customers about their satisfaction with the experience. and invest very heavily in trying to make that as healthy and strong as possible to make their customers happy, because they know that directly ties to retention. And secondly, if the customer has an issue and they interact with the customer support organization, that also creates an experience, right? Are they getting the help that they need? Are they getting access to information that solves their problem? And I think when we talk with most subscription companies, they tend to think about their subscriber experiences within those two buckets, the product experience and the support experience. But the payments experience is really the other interaction point that subscribers have with their subscription companies. And the perspective of the subscriber is, I just expect my payment experience to be clean. I gave you my credit card, I expect it to clear, and I expect it to work. And so that really comes down to the interesting part about the payments experience as opposed to the other experiences is that it either is good and positive and it just works as it, and the customer is never aware of the payment being submitted and clearing, or there's a problem. And that's really why the payment experience is such a crucial area to focus on because when a problem occurs, like for example with a failed payment, the way the brand interacts, the way they manage it and solve that has an outsized impact on the outcomes with the customer in terms of satisfaction and retention. In fact, we'll get into this a little bit, but the payments experience, when it goes bad, is often the single largest source of churn that subscription companies had.
Super interesting. I'm curious to everybody listening, do you track churn? I'm assuming everybody does, but do you track involuntary churn, anything that's related to the payment experience separately in your KPIs? I'm just curious if you want to do a yes or no. I'm the one that's looking at it, so nobody else is going to see it. So I'm just curious if you are or you're not. And Steve, you brought some interesting charts. Would it be appropriate to share that with everybody right now?
Yeah, because I think it's helpful to not just think about the perspective of the payment as an operational process that you hope works properly, but the impact on your subscribers, on customers is pretty profound. And we have a lot of data from proprietary research we conducted the last couple of years that gives really interesting insights into how subscribers react when there is a problem.
All right, I have
So,
your first slide up. Yep.
yeah, great. I see it. So, I think it's instructive to think about when we have I think almost everybody's experienced a failed payment, whether you're interacting with a retailer in store, whether you're traveling with your family on vacation and you try to use a card in a gas station that's declined because your bank is assigned you're outside your trade area, or whether there's an interaction with a subscription company. But what's really, really clear, and again, I think it's understandable because whenever we experience a failed payment, it's a negative reaction. It's always emotional. Like, why was my card declined? Uh, and we see this from our data that there is a very direct change in satisfaction with the subscription provider when their customers experience it. Over a third of customers instantly report a decrease in satisfaction with the provider. And I think it's not surprising we see that result. If the consumer and this is true whether or not your customer is a business or whether it's a consumer. When the card is working elsewhere, when the card works everywhere else they try to use it, and it's just being declined with your brand, often the reaction on the part of the consumers, they don't blame the bank, which is actually the institution that's responsible for declining the payment. When they decide that there's a risk of fraud and they'd rather decline the payment with the risk of making a bad decision on the approval versus taking the risk of approving a fraudulent transaction, um, then what the consumer sees is that my card works everywhere else and just doesn't connect with you. So what they do is they blame the brand. They don't blame the bank, and that's really where the root of this creates, which is if the initial experience is going to be negative, the likelihood that the consumer is going to help you solve the problem decreases dramatically. And uh, and
Noted.
so one of the questions we want to ask when we talk to consumers about how they responded when a failed payment occurred is that there's very high levels of negative outcomes that are directly related to churn. So we see from this data is that you're looking at over a third of your base that either just chooses to let the subscription terminate by not helping. What was really fascinating is that when we asked consumers when the failed payment occurred, what did you do? And their answer was, well, I still wanted that product or service. I just had such a negative experience with this brand that I let my subscription cancel and chose to go find a similar product or service from a competitor. And that I think is a really good validation point for us that when we look at, we talk about voluntary churn, involuntary churn. With voluntary churn, usually the reasons that a subscriber cancels a subscription is that they either don't have a need for the product or service anymore, or they find another alternative, or they're perhaps making tough decisions on their household budget. This is a great call out that there's no disagreement that they still want the product or service, that negative experience caused them to look elsewhere. And so what we want to avoid when we talk about the payments experience is creating a experience for the consumer that really tries to avoid this outcome so that we increase overall customer retention, we avoid the negative perceptions, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we want to really have subscription companies rethink what they even look at as the core goals when a failed payment occurs. I think most companies tend to look at failed payments as an operational problem, and we really encourage the idea that when companies approach voluntary churn, when they're trying to reduce the number of times their customers are saying, I'd like to cancel my subscription, they approach that problem from a very strategic perspective. They invest in people that are responsible for developing programs to avoid this occurring. They invest in systems and technology to work to engage with customers and increase satisfaction. There's gathering feedback and data that helps understand where there's risks of churn. They probably put in intervention programs when there's a request for churn. They have metrics and tracking systems to really look at every phase of that, trying to reduce that number. It's treated very seriously. Involuntary churn, though, is often treated as a transactional problem. That's when we talk about how we look at this and frame the problem. We encourage customers to say, or subscription companies to say, we want you to look at involuntary churn with the same level of rigor, the same level of priority and urgency, and the same level of strategic thoughtfulness as you do with voluntary churn, because the outcomes are just as negative for you, and the harm that they cause in your overall profitability and revenue is just as profound.
I think that's so important. Some of the most successful companies that I know in the subscription economy really view payments strategically, and across teams. Obviously, the operations team might be leading the technical capabilities of it, but they're really integrated across the expertise across teams. So if I were going to boil down what you just said, in layman's terms, it's all about your customers, your potential subscribers, and your active subscribers, their reaction to the experience that they've had in regards to payments. And I'm curious, what drives those? What's the background behind your customers' reactions to these negative payments? What's driving this negative payment impression?
It comes down to the connection people have with their financial health and the reactions when the cards they have that are given them by bank or issued by banks don't work the way they expect to. It becomes a very personal reaction. Like, again, my card works everywhere else. Why is it not working with you? It must be you that's the problem, not me. And so clearly, any failed payment that is not resolved and not recovered, the end result of that is churn. You've lost that customer because they're unable to continue with the relationship with you. When we talk about the experience, we want to make sure that the understanding is really, really high that when a failed payment occurs, how you deal with it, how you interact, how you work to solve it, and if you have to interact with your subscriber for a solution, has a direct relationship on what the outcome is. We talk about this idea that uh, the good news that we see with most subscription companies, particularly the larger ones, is that they recognize that failed payments occur and they've taken the first steps to solving them. The gap that we see, though, is that often the payment system itself is viewed as a back office system. It's owned by operations, it's owned by the technology team, and usually the mandate is just make the cost of operating that as low as possible. And so when the team responsible for managing their payments addresses the failed payment problem, they typically take the same orientation of, well, I'm just going to develop a low-cost solution to try to resolve the problem. What it looks like in practice is we see a lot of companies take the first step by building just retry systems, right? If I have 100 customers this month whose payments failed, we're just going to write a routine to resubmit those payments over and over again until we try to get it clear. The other reaction we see a lot of companies take is that every time a customer experiences a failed payment, they'll just take those names and push them over to the customer support team and have them reach out and send us some emails or make some phone calls trying to get them to resolve the problem. And I think it's so important to recognize that when the problem is viewed as an operational problem, like I had an operational transaction that didn't complete, let's do everything we can to solve it. That is usually the outcome is just to try to do some low level cheap things to do. What we really think it's important for security companies to understand is that shift your thinking on this from an operational problem to a churn problem. So what that leads to, I think, very quickly is the sea change in thinking that my solution should not be an operational solution. I should look at this as with retention solutions, just like you do with voluntary churn. So it forces a much more strategic and more thoughtful approach to look at the problem holistically and look at this in a way where we really want to invest in people and technology and systems, just the way we do with voluntary churn. So, for example, what does that mean? So, we see some companies have taken first steps of crafting a new role called the Chief Subscription Officer. And that person is responsible for looking across the entire company, looking at the experiences that are being crafted across all phases of the subscriber lifecycle. And they can break down the organizational barriers to take a more holistic perspective. And those companies are really on the leading edge. And I don't think necessarily you have to take the step of creating a chief subscription officer with overall profit responsibility for your customers and retention responsibility. But the idea that the people who are involved in voluntary churn, if they are brought into the failed payment solution development, they can bring in their perspective that they know that when the customer has to be involved in recovery process, what they're going to look at is not just what the outcome is in the short term, but they're going to measure really important attributes like was the customer satisfied coming out of the experience. They're going to measure the retention of those customers after the experience to make sure that their lifetime value of following that is going to be as high as possible. So we're able to, when companies take this with a broader perspective and think about it more strategically, they're able to bring in resources and apply technology that are really optimized not just to deliver a short-term gain on recovery, but think in the long term about how can we develop a solution that will, of course, increase recovery, but also optimize customer satisfaction and customer retention of the affected customers in the long run.
So that chief subscription officer per se is measuring satisfaction, the brand experience, KPIs around the churn, voluntary and involuntary, working across teams and probably legal because of, all the legal changes and really making sure all the teams are operating together. So when people have implemented these types or companies have implemented this type of strategic thinking, what type of results are you seeing and observing?
This is what's so powerful about unlocking the opportunity that exists for every subscription company. It's important, again, to reset our understanding. The whole attractiveness of the subscription model is that as a company, we can go out and acquire customers. We know we have to pay money to acquire those customers, and often that can be substantial, right? For consumer-based subscriptions, we see often with our customers that the cost of acquisition equals 4, 5, 6, 7 billing cycles. So if you're acquiring customers and your cost of acquisition is that high, at the minimum, not even covering the cost of delivery of the product or service, you have to have retention rates that will extend beyond that period. For business to business software, that customer acquisition cost, the CAC, can often be 15, 18, 24 months of billing. So the cost of acquisition is one of the largest cost centers or cost drivers within those companies. But think about the opportunity exists when you are able to avoid the churn event. You're driving revenue for that customer, and there's no customer acquisition cost associated with it. So the revenue that's being created by increasing retention is incredibly accretive to earnings. So it drives much higher profitability. And the other dimension that we see many subscription companies not take into account when they evaluate different solutions is the recognition that when I save customers from churn this month, they're going to bill. And next month, when the failed payments occur, I'm going to save those customers from churn. But the customers I saved last month are going to continue to bill again in the second month. And so you get this effect of compounding revenue growth because you start stacking up new cohorts of customers that previously would have churned and are now delivering additional revenue and start dropping profits to the bottom line. So the companies that get this right really deliver outsized performance on uh, we have customers that are both public and private. So we're able to see the effect with our public customers on the difference before and after on their profits. We actually see the enterprise value increase because we've seen companies move from net loss to net profits, from their EBITDA from negative to positive. So it can be incredibly powerful. There's enormous amounts of financial leverage that can be unlocked by starting to increase retention by reducing failed payment.
And that's all just from looking at it strategic, which is really, really powerful. I'd encourage anybody that has more questions on this to put it in the chat, but I want to dive down into a little bit more tactical. What are some of the raw causes of failed payments?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is something that's often not well understood. But why do failed payments occur, right? We all expect the payment system works as the way it should, that the banking system and the card networks are able to identify fraudulent transactions and they're blocked the way they should. We don't want the bad actors to be rewarded. And the good transactions, the ones that are legitimate, where the merchant and the customer want to interact together and there's available credit, they clear as they should. The reality is much different, though. And it really comes from fraud and efforts by the banks that issue cards to try to minimize their fraud losses. Um, the way we talk about this is that the banks incur globally about $30 billion in fraud losses, and their efforts to try to minimize those losses, they've overcompensated and are declining valid transactions that should be approved. Right, it's a willing customer has a subscription, they want to purchase the product or service, but the payment's being blocked because the bank thinks there's a high risk of a fraudulent event occurring. When in reality that doesn't exist in many cases. We also, I think many companies would think that, well, MasterCard and Visa are large networks, there's sophisticated solutions and technology, but the reality is that the payment rails themselves, the systems that are being used, were never really built for today's world where you have enormous levels of online transactions and subscription models. And of course, all the bad actors have gone online, so that's where the fraud occurs. And the banks know this, and they overcompensate based on the transactions. In fact, the banks, when they see a transaction being submitted for approval, there are codes attached to it. Was this an in-person event purchase? Was it online? Was it subscription billing? Those are all codes that the bank demands to see. And they treat those different types of transactions differently because they know there's different levels of risk. And that's where you see the outcomes. So the payment rails themselves are a little bit outdated. They haven't been actually meaningfully updated since 1978. And so their ability to adapt to the world of very different types of transactions and much more aggressive bad actors has led to this problem. And so the failed payments are occurring because of limitations of the system. And this is where I think it's important to remind everybody that fraud exists. Fraud is not going away. In fact, fraud rates are increasing. We see new trends where the new AI tools that are becoming widely available, like ChatGPT and other generative AI, are actually giving new capabilities to bad actors to game the system. And so the reality is that fraud will continue to increase, and the reactions by the banking system to try to adapt to it means that this problem is not going away.
Mm. I mean, even as a consumer, I can see the increased activity on fraud alerts just because I'm doing an extra one or two purchases, and it's somewhat annoying, I have to say, because they're all legit. But that's the state of the world that we're in right now. So
Yeah, and just one more, I want to dive into a little bit on when we talked about the payments experience. I think it's right to ask, what is a good payments experience? What do we really want to craft? We know that the consumer expects the payment just to clear and to work as they intended to. So when we talk about a failed payment, what is the best possible outcome that we can have as an industry?
Mhm.
And what we really want to do is replicate the experience that the consumer expects, which is I gave you my card, it just works. So the best experience when a failed payment occurs is that we're able to work with the banking system and find a way to resubmit the payment with a strategy that drives an approval for legitimate transactions. In that way, the approval is issued usually fairly quickly, and it is done so without the customer's knowledge. So the benefits of that are tremendous, right? The customer is never aware that the failed payment occurred. There's no chance of a negative experience or a negative a degradation on the brand satisfaction from occurring, and their subscription just continued along as they intended to. There's a complete avoidance of any harm to retention or LTV. That's best. That's exactly what we want every time. But we know that there's some decline types. Examples of this are the card has expired, the card's been shut down because of suspected fraud, the bank that card will never work again. That we do have to involve interaction on the part of the subscriber. So in those cases, how you interact, how you address and manage that with your subscribers is absolutely vital. The old way of defining experience is usually just send that over to customer service and see if they'll reach out and get the customer to agree to give you a new card. But the reality is that when you talk to customers, there are different drivers that will give you the outcome you're looking for. People respond in different ways. Sometimes enough education is enough. Like, you tell me that my card expired, and great, I still want to go forward, and I'll give you a new one. Other consumers, they'll react in different ways with different messaging. So having a system that is flexible enough to find a message that's going to resonate with each individual customer is incredibly important. And the way that you even measure success should be upgraded from I had, these examples, I had 100 failed payments and I had to reach out to 50 of those. Did I recover 50 of the failed payments? Of course, you want to look at the failed payment, but absolutely recommend continue to monitor the customer satisfaction after that experience. Because if you see that your dissatisfaction is starting to increase or there's harm to your brand, our data tells us that there will be subsequent unwanted churn very quickly after that. When we see customers choose to go to competitors, and measure the retention of the customers that go through that experience to make sure that you're doing everything you can to optimize that as high as possible. Because that's, again, once you increase LTV, which should be the objective of every subscription company, then you start to drive those outside gains in revenues and profits.
So
I think this is a plug. I'm going to be talking at the subscription show you mentioned at the end of October, and I'm actually going to be talking about the ways that you can improve financial measurement of retention programs in general. Failed payment recoveries is certainly one of them, but in general, I think that there are some gaps in the way that the accounting system is developed that don't align necessarily with subscription-based companies. And so we'll dive into that a little bit of how companies can rethink and provide some suggestions for new metrics that provide a better way and an easier way to understand when you start to increase retention, what impact does it have on revenue and profits.
it's going to be a very interesting session. We'll get back to that in a second, but I want to talk a little bit about people listening to you right now. How do they get started about and thinking about in their organizations designing and managing great payment experiences? How do you get started?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the first steps that I think every company should take is, if you don't measure your voluntary and involuntary churn separately and understand the impact of your customer losses from this problem, start doing it now. It's fairly easy to do. You can look at the outcomes of your payment reporting, and when you see that the failed payment occurred, start to track, did that result in the customer being lost? And that'll start to give you a sense and a percentage. We see, and it varies for every company, right? Every company's a little bit different. There's different dimensions of their customers and their business model. But it's very common for the percentage of churn to be 40 to 50% coming from involuntary churn. It can be that high. And of course, if all of your investment and retention programs is only being aimed at voluntary churn, then you're not able to solve fully half of the churn that's occurring. So that's number one. Number two, start to understand, particularly if you're the individual that's responsible for retention, most likely the things that I'm talking about with failed payments, the payment processing system, is happening somewhere else in your company, and they're probably invisible to you. So reach out, find out who that group is that's responsible for the payment system, and start to get involved in asking questions about what are you doing when a failed payment occurs? What are the systems and processes we have in place now? Where are those transactions going? What is the outcome of it? And start to measure that. and then start to gain buy-in to the idea that instead of isolating the strategies for how companies deal with failed payments solely within the back office, the operations team, start to create a cross-functional group that's responsible for this with retention people, with operations and customer support, and of course finance and operations, and let everybody bring their expertise to bear so that the more holistic perspective can start to be adopted, and the solutions that you choose, the way that people gain the responsibility and visibility to the causes of churn, and the systems that you choose can be elevated in a way that really starts to optimize recovery, but also satisfaction and retention of those customers.
Amazing. That's really, really smart and great advice, Steve. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation at Subscription Show. And I want to just, before we take any other Q&A and any final remarks, I just want to remind everybody, I am going to make sure everybody gets a replay of this discussion. And with that, I'll put a little discount code for all of you for the Subscription Show. And our goal is to get all of this edited and out by end of day today. So you should be able to have that. The Subscription Show, as I mentioned at the top, we'll be covering strategic trends. We'll be having companies like The Atlantic and The Information, NBA, YouTube, and Steve and SurveyMonkey, and all sorts of companies really talking about strategic to tactical. We have one session on negotiating prices with your payment vendors, which is really interesting. And we also have for people on the Zoom call another session on distribution and working with telco companies on large distribution deals. So it really covers leading experts like Steve talking about strategic payment issues to strategy. So just want to give that to you and understand if there's any other questions. I know people have been asking questions along the way, so we might not have that. And I don't think I do see any. So Steve, do you have any final recommendations or comments for people as they get started with their organization?
I do, of course, FlexPay and we are resources. So even if you just want to talk about what you're doing and compare what best in class looks like, please reach out. We're happy to have the conversation, regardless of whether we choose to do business or not in the future. I think again, we talk about this problem. Shift your focus from this is a failed payment problem to this is a retention problem that directly drives improvements in revenue and profits. I think that orientation is really helpful. The second thing I'd like to ask everybody to understand is that this problem, the failed payment problem, the frictions in the payment system, the banks making incorrect decisions, is inherent in the payment system. It exists, it's not going away. So the reality is it's affecting every subscription company to some degree or another, some more than others, right? What that means is that the overall financial performance of every single subscription company, the key metrics that matter to them, customer retention, revenue, and profits, are all lower than they can be, or really what they should be. If this problem didn't exist, then customer retention would be higher and revenue profits would be higher in these companies. Now, this problem is so large and so pervasive that we think that every subscription company in 3 or 4 years is going to have a specialized solution in place because the impact on their business is so profound. And this is the interesting point, the companies that understand the problem and work to solve it now are going to realize quick gains in the customer retention. They're going to deliver more revenue and profits, and they're going to create more opportunities for growth that their competitors cannot match. They might in 3 years when they catch up, but they can't do it today. So the early adopters that move forward now create a window of opportunity where they have more resources. They can go out and acquire customers that might not have been profitable before because the retention and the LTV gets higher. They give new opportunities for investing in the core product, which means that they can start to gain a competitive advantage against their competitive set. All these opportunities are created. So the companies understand this, will take advantage quickly, are going to be able to have an outsized influence on their performance and gain 3 or 4 years of advantage over their other competitors. So that's really the opportunity that exists now is don't just act quickly.
Boom. You've heard it here, everybody. This is what we need to be focused on right here and right now in all of your organizations. Thank you, Steve. Quick
Yep.
question. If anybody does have any follow-up questions for you, what is your email? How can they get in touch with you?
My email is SARENTZOFF at flexpay.io. Apologize, the last name is a little bit difficult to spell, but it's on the invite, of course. And so the first initial, last name. Of course, you can always go to the website and submit a request, or even go to find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to talk. Very passionate about this topic. It's incredibly important for every subscription company to really focus on and work to solve. So anything I can do to help, I'm at your disposal.
Thank you so much, Steve. If anybody has any questions for me, please reach out to me, Kathy at subscriptioninsider.com. And until next time, thank you so much for your time today, and we will see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.